let's start with our first topic, which is today we find this is something that's happening practical, that certification wise you could be a certified lead auditor, internal auditor. This is not just to you. You may also have peers who are certified in various auditing skills, but why don't them get converted into or translate into an audit readiness? Because we all know that when we go for certifications, we are explained concepts, but in real time audits are not do not happen in an environment which is very clean, structured and straightforward, even though we may wish it to be. So you will find a lot of real world environments which are very messy, and you will find what we call as evidences which is very incomplete. So there are two aspects that are expected from an auditor. One is, are you able to figure out the right inputs? What are the gaps? And most importantly, what is it that you would want the teams to do? Sometimes they may even expect you to give some recommendations, right? So now as an auditor, if I have to recommend something, one, I should be familiar and should have the expertise of the environment that I am auditing, and I should have the knowledge and skill to recommend good things. While recommendations are not mandatory for auditors, when you present your audit reports to senior management, they just don't want gap finding. They want gap finding along with solutions, right? So that's going to be the key difference between theory and reality. Most of you should be familiar that audits happen with checklist helps us in assisting and managing the time that we have during audits. But a good audit, a high impactful audit, will not just be checklist based, right? You may throw a question and the auditee, that is the person whom you're auditing, is responding to it, right? From the response, how do you derive additional questions? It is impossible for you to validate all the documents prior to audit. So during audit, you should be in for surprises. So you may get to see a totally different document. So how do you derive judgments from it? And how do you adapt to the context? There are times, a lot of times, when I have done audits, that I would have anticipated somebody to participate in the audit, but even the representative could change. Or maybe what was expected to be shown as an evidence on paper will be available on a tool, right? And each tool comes with its own set of complexities. So how do you adapt and make decisions instantly? That becomes very critical. We all know that the biggest challenge in audits is the resistance that we get from stakeholders, from auditees. Now, why is that resistance? It's a natural human behavior that when somebody comes, especially somebody who's external, comes and questions, right? Then the thought process could be that, why are they coming and questioning us? What are they trying to validate? And maybe are they here to find faults or mistakes in our system? This could be a very natural thought process, irrespective of the background, the culture, and the geographies that you come from. So we are not going to be welcomed here, right? So the question is, how do you handle that resistance and still do an effective audit? Some of the easiest ways to navigate audits from the other side is that nobody takes ownership. So you throw up a question and they say that this is not under my control. This is not under my purview. You'll have to ask this to somebody else. Somebody else directs it to somebody else. So where does this loop end? It does not. Now, for all of this, these are not things that you can discover during the audit, because or we all know that audits are time bound exercises. So let's say the coming Monday, you plan an audit from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. You have to start or whether you start the audit at 9 or not is immaterial. You'll have to end it by 11. So in that 2 hours, you cannot be struggling to find who owns this, right? What could be the related documents? This is where what we are going to do as part of our detailed course is that we are going to go through the entire life cycle of audits. It's not just about creating a checklist and what are the questions that you will ask against a set of processes or controls. How do you prepare for an audit? What are the key things that you should be aware of before you go to any kind of audit, right? That is also something that we are going to look at, right? We all know that as an auditor, if you come out with a specific finding or an outcome, you should be in a position to justify it, right? So when it comes to justification, it is not just enough that you have a document existing or not existing. It is also about how is that, whether you see it in the form of a document or inside a tool, or you observe something during the audit, how is it relevant, reliable to the outcome that you are concluding, right? And invariably, audit is a people skill, right? Which means your techniques of how do you throw relevant questions, right? Because what we must understand is as we get smarter in conducting high impactful audits, so are the audience, right? So you will find varied kinds of people participating on audits, from the senior management to people on the ground, right? People who are technically very sound, right? And they may start explaining things sometimes which we may not able to understand, right? Anytime, even if you come out with a genuine finding, you may have to negotiate, convince, right? Probably answer a couple of people before you can bring it into your report. So which means your job and our job unfortunately does not end in the 2 hours after we complete the audit. The struggle continues, right? So which means, how do we make sure that we ask the right questions, we arrive at the right evidence, and most importantly, we may have to sometimes have a different opinion. We may have to challenge even senior stakeholders within the organization. But in whatever we do, we continue to be professionals. We continue to articulate it in the best interest of the organization, right? At the end of the day, what I have felt a lot of times when I have conducted audits, the one question that we may have to keep in mind is like, am I adding value to the organization that I am working for? Okay. Okay, I just see a question that we are still in the first slide. Yes, we are still in the first slide. I am still talking about what is the difference that you will find between a certification that you have gone through and a real time audit. I hope that helps. Okay, I am moving on to the next slide. I hope you are able to see key challenges in audits. Okay, thank you. No worries. Okay. Now, what is it that you are going to see? Now, please note, maybe for the auditing group, this is our bread and butter, right? I remember in my auditing days, right, I have conducted 3 audits every day. And let's say if we are 20 working days in a month, I would on an average do 40 audits. So to me, doing audits is like getting up, waking up, brushing, and something like that. It's a routine, right? But that's not the case with the teams that we are auditing. So a lot of times, organizations, just for the sake of compliance, would prepare documents, right? Sometimes I have seen cases where when you go and talk to them, they may say that, hey, we can only give you half an hour and we will send all screenshots over email. Please check it out, right? And we all know how much you can rely on screenshot. So does it mean that you will not accept screenshot as an evidence? Nothing like that, right? But the question is, like, what are you validating in that screenshot? Suppose, let's say I get an email, hey, you've done a change recently, is this change approved? Yes, I can send you an email that the change is approved, right? Is that enough? Not really. How do you go beyond it? For example, if you see the first example, one of the basic questions that we have to ask whenever we validate access management as a control is, are accesses reviewed at regular intervals? This is a very common question, right? And typically, as an evidence, they may show you a recent review report or a screenshot, right? But the question is that, what was reviewed, right? Is it like I opened a active directory and I just went through a list of people who have access? Is that what I did? Now, who were the users who were reviewed? For example, we even expect that all kinds of users should be reviewed, starting from somebody who has an admin or a root level access, to somebody who has an update access, to somebody who has read only access. And this somebody can be an employee of the organization, could be a contractor, could be a third party, right? And isn't there a single case where somebody who should not be given access was given? If yes, was it identified in an internal review, and how was it remediated? Now, when you start, maybe this may not be the right word, but just within this group, when you start poking a little further, that is where gaps will start emerging. So, getting an evidence is not a big thing, but validating, and we should have the depth in us to go and validate it to the maximum extent possible. Second, one of the common evidences that you're going to get is policy documents, right? Now, with the advent of AI, let's be very honest that it is no big deal to create a policy document, right? And you just have to give your specifications to a AI, and it's going to generate you in a document in a couple of minutes. You can just tweak the reviewer and approver, and you can present it as, a document that is available, right? So what is it that we could be missing? See, 90% of the times these policy documents are only read and probably will be aware by only till a particular level. It might not have penetrated within the team. So, a lot of times when I have done audits, anytime I look at a policy document, I go and talk about it to people on the ground. For example, let's say a developer who is trying to push the code into production, right? I go and talk to him like, hey, do you know your development policy? Have you ever seen it? What do you know what is written there and what are you doing on the ground? Sometimes I have taken a sentence from the policy document and I've asked him, like, how do you interpret this sentence? What is your understanding? Now, that is where, because the policy document is not for the auditor, a lot of organizations don't understand it. You can fool the auditor today by showing a very nice document. But tomorrow, if nobody within your organization knows about it or even understands it, right, then there is no point in having that policy, right? And considering, let's say, if you are an auditor of information security or cyber security, just as a domain, you have 100 different controls there, and each of those controls may have their own set of requirements which could be documented within a policy or a procedure document. So the question is, who is reading all these? People who need to read should read. There is no point in just the GRC teams who have created it and keeping it up to date, right? That is where we always validate policies against implementation. And when you do that, naturally, you will find gaps. Okay. Now, another common aspect that we need to look at is that you can take a checklist and you can keep asking one question after the other, maybe, as an exercise of, being compliant, that you've verified all the controls. So I have 30 questions in my checklist, and I want to verify all the 30 in the next 2 hours and complete, and I want to present that I have done a full-fledged audit. Now when you start doing that, what will happen is, you are only doing a yes or a no exercise. You cannot have good impactful findings from it, right? In fact, the very questions that we ask, for example, hey, do you have a, let's take a control like backup, right? Do you have a backup policy? How often do you back up, right? When was your last backup? Now for all of these questions, you may say a yes or a no from the auditing, or they may give you a specific answer, right? For example, our last backup happened over the last weekend, something like that. Rather than that, if you can throw a question like, hey, can you explain your backup process to me, right? I would like to know how your backups typically happen, and you push somewhere the auditee to open up and speak. Now, that is where you may get a lot of information from the ground, which even the policy document or the procedure document may not reflect, right? So, in the process of explaining, right, see, at the end of the day, we still in a pace where we are auditing human beings. I don't know, maybe we might be heading to a pace where we could be auditing artificial intelligence systems or robots. But when you talk to a human being, there is so much that comes from the mind and the heart, which a document will never reflect. So, suppose, let's say the auditee, if you throw a question like this, can you explain your process? The auditee says that, hey, we've had a process like this, but right now we are trying to change something because we had a backup error last week. Now, that is not something that any document is going to capture unless and otherwise you motivate the auditee to speak. Now, the moment you get that clue, you start probing further. Like, how often do such errors happen? Is this the first time, or has it happened before? Now, even here, you may have very smart auditees who may not open up, but if you keep attempting this, I trust me, I can assure you that you will end up getting such kind of outputs that you can never ever drive from the typical that you will never ever get from the typical evidences that you look for, right? So that is what we are primarily looking at in terms of the what could be typical challenges and how do you overcome them. Here are few sentences that I have put together. These are sentences from a risk assessment procedure. Kindly provide the list of assets with location, particulars, and asset codes, right? This is something that Ganesh would ask. Thank you. Okay. Classify each asset to the importance and key of to the operations. Okay. So you're basically looking at, can they list the assets and classify them? Okay. Thank you. Bharat says, produce the results of the risk assessment, how often it is being, how often the review is being performed. Okay, good point. because we are talking of a risk assessment procedure here. There are certain steps, but they're not talking of how often risk assessments are being conducted. So it's good to know. Okay, thank you, Bharat. They're saying that for all the assets whose risk is greater than the acceptable value of risk set by the management, okay, implement the controls and get the CISO's approval for the decided risk criteria. But what is that criteria? It is not mentioned anywhere. When they tell you that, see, there is a, who has created this risk assessment procedure? It has been created by the organization. So when they give you sentences like this, you have to find questions in the sentences. What you are asking is whatever is existing beyond that, what you need. Like for example, what are the controls to be implemented? Yes, all your questions are valid, but beyond that, what I would ask is, for the first sentence, the sentence says identify the assets and classify them into 5 categories. My question as an auditor to the team will be, what do these 5 categories represent? Like, what do you mean by people asset? What do you mean by software asset? If you don't give that description, then what will happen is somebody will classify something as software, somebody else will classify the same thing as physical. So you cannot just give categories, you have to give a description of the category. That is missing. I will ask for that. First point. Second point, they're saying rate each asset on a scale of 1 to 5. Even here, if you see, rate on a scale of 1 to 5. One point that you must take back is, in the procedure document, you cannot just give a range of values without giving a definition or explanation for each of the values. What I mean by that is, 1 means so and so, 2 means very high. Very high means what? Because see, tomorrow this procedure again is not for the auditor, it is for the people who are conducting risk assessments within the organization, right? So if somebody has to give a rating of 2 or 3 or 4, they should know why they have to give 2, 3 and 4. What does 2 means, 3 means, or 4 means? So I will not accept a scale of 1 to 5 unless I know what each of the values mean. Okay, that is the level of details that you must look for. Second, just one more point. Conduct risk assessment on an asset or group of assets. On an asset is understandable, right? For example, you take a firewall and you conduct a risk assessment on it. You take one endpoint device and conduct a risk assessment on it. Great. But why are you saying group of assets, and how will you group the assets? Because if you don't explain this in the procedure, what is going to happen? Why do I want an explanation of category? Why do I want an explanation of numbers or scale? Why do I want an explanation of group of assets? Because as I'm repeatedly telling you, if the procedure is not going to give these details, people who are going to use this procedure and conduct risk assessments on the ground, they will not have clarity, and they are going to put their own values in conducting risk assessment. And what is the danger in doing that? There will not be a consistent quality output. When you don't have a good procedure which explains things in detail, people are going to assume. When people start assuming, the kind of outputs, what is the output from a risk assessment? What are the top risks that we must address? And if you don't do it properly, you are not going to identify the right risks, and ultimately it's going to impact the organization. So we validate every sentence written and we look at what is missing in each of these sentences. right? I hope it makes sense. We are going to do such detailed exercises as part of our um, extensive program. In the interest of time, I will move on, but just in case somebody has something else to add on, please use the chat. Okay. I have faced this personally as an auditor, that I would have put my heart and soul in conducting an audit for 2 to 3 hours. And if I am not able to articulate it into a strong, effective finding, all my effort goes waste. I still find majority of the auditors, see, it's not, a lot of auditors have very good checklist. Using the checklist, they will conduct a very good audit. But where do they lack? They lack in articulating the findings. You will still find very, very generic findings like change approvals missing. See, if I am a senior manager, and if you are auditors and you give me something like this, change approvals missing, I will not respect you as an auditor. You have to tell me how many samples did you take, right? You cannot tell me that I took 100 samples, out of which I found only one approval missing. Okay, now that should not be treated as a normal scenario. So you have to clearly tell me how many samples you took, out of which in how many samples, let's say an approval or a review, whatever you are charging as an issue is missing, and very importantly, what is the impact? See, if you tell me your backup process is not effective, changes approval is missing, my question to you will be, so what? I have not had any incident within my organization so far. I have not been subjected to a cyber attack. So why are you worried about change approvals missing and backup process being ineffective? So that is where in the course, for all kinds of findings, we will repeatedly try to articulate, right? So there are some best practices that we will learn in terms of telling exactly, guys, today you don't have an incident, and if you continue to miss this, this is what will happen, right? So you find that you can read what is written on the top and the bottom, and you will clearly find the difference. So when you bring in the number of samples, when you bring in what you have seen during the audit, see, we always say that whatever you have seen, you must articulate. Otherwise, it will look like, see, maybe even when you say change approvals are missing, you are correct. You are not lying as an auditor. You have really seen approvals missing, but the impact is not getting articulated appropriately. And that is, unfortunately, there are two things that happens. One is they start questioning the credibility of the auditor. So the next time you go for an audit, you will see that difference. Yeah, this is very true for internal auditors, especially because we may have to face the same teams repeatedly. And second is, even if your finding is genuine, they will not take any action. And that's a problem to the organization also. So we have to spend some time and practice how to write findings strongly. So this is my suggestion, right? I'm being very practical here as to what is happening in the industry. See, what is expected is this. Let's say you are an auditor, you've conducted an audit, and you have identified some gaps and you're trying to articulate it. Number one, please first write it in your own words. Do not worry about whether you've covered everything or not. As we are going to practice in the full-fledged session, you will be taught extensively how to articulate. So learn that and write it. What you can do is, please remove any kind of, let's say, direct reference to your organization's information. Remove that and make it a generic finding without giving specifications. And you can use a Copilot or a Google Gemini just to validate the grammar of it or maybe the effectiveness of it. For instance, you've used certain language or a word, and if Copilot can give you a better word for it in terms of impact, nothing wrong in using it. But do not copy paste the entire finding as it is, because that will be considered leakage of information. Because what you're copy pasting is a scenario existing within the organization, and that can put you in trouble. Okay, so in order to you use AI for fine tuning, but do not just expect AI to phrase everything for you, because AI has not done the audit, you have done the audit. Okay, thank you for bringing that up, Bharat. Okay, just to move on, right? If you have a strong observation, what it means is you should answer all of these questions, like what went wrong, what is the evidence, very important, how big is the issue, and why does it matter. The last question is what the leadership is going to look for, right? Why does it matter, right? And in the session we're going to learn how to be very findings cannot be generic. For example, I will tell you, you and I can audit the same project, the same context. Your thought process and my thought process as an auditor can be very different. So the kind of outcomes that you will produce and I will produce will be different. Okay? Always link your audit findings to business impact. That is what will sell. If you're going to say that, firewalls are misconfigured, especially technical controls, you cannot articulate it exactly in the technical way. And we will learn how to use a clear structure as part of our extended training session. Okay, so how are you going to differentiate yourself when you present yourself as high impactful auditors in front of your hiring managers, right? See, every time you've done a good audit, right, and you have really identified outcomes of it, that that is something that you have to speak during your interviews. Not just the number frameworks or controls or how many controls you audited. So nowadays it has become very important for you to showcase your hands-on auditing experience. That's the whole intention behind conducting a training program like this, and this webinar is a beginning for it. Okay, if you have done it, you will be able to articulate it very clearly. See, I have seen interviews. In fact, I have conducted interviews where I have given a scenario to people and asked them to convert it into a risk finding in front of me. And by looking at their writing, I will know whether they have written something like that before or not. Right? And if it is AI copied, it becomes very visible, because there are certain knacks that AI will not know. Only a real auditor who has conducted the audit will know. You need technical understanding because it will help you when you talk to people, but it is not just about technical understanding. Nobody is going to come and ask an auditor how to configure a firewall and what are the network protocols used. That is the role of a network administrator, not of an auditor. So for an auditor, your role is how do you evaluate evidences? How can you analytically think and logically, align? Even the way you sequence your findings becomes very important, right? One of the default question, I can write it and give it to you today, is going to be when you go and sit for an auditing interview is, how did you manage a tough stakeholder during audit? And unless you have done it, right, unless you have faced it, it becomes very difficult to manipulate a question like this, right? And as you go start auditing people at higher levels, I'm sure you will get that exposure, right? So you need to differentiate from what typically happens, right? And that becomes very, very important. Okay. Last but not least, I'll finish this and then I will open up for any general questions, right? So, with this background, with the last 40-45 minutes that we've been running through this, what we are planning is a full-fledged 40-hour audit, GRC IT audit, practical approach training. There are some key points that I want you to take back, and I'm sure it will help you either if you're trying to switch your career into audits or you want to become high impactful auditors. One is, this training is not just about conducting audits, it is about planning, conducting, how do you test your controls, and reporting. And we are intentionally covering all core GRC domains, in the sense all the ITGC controls. We are taking every control. The reason why we've made this 40 hours is we are taking all important controls and we're going to deep dive how to audit each of them, right? You could be 27001 or you may have certifications like CISA already. You may theoretically very strong, but here we're going to also align our the entire training program to the most prominent auditing frameworks like 27001 SOC 2. And throughout we're going to follow the principle of risk based auditing, starting from planning an audit, conducting an audit, and reporting an audit. How do you do a risk based audit? And we will run through all execution skills, like how do you select samples, right? How do you validate evidences? How do you go and in depth and see what could be the root cause? And very importantly, how do you frame your outcomes? How do you rate them? How do you align them? And what are the things that you must present when it goes to a senior management versus different levels? So for each of these, I am bringing in my real-time experience. So it will all be very, very similar to your, industry scenario. Okay. And it will be based on actual audit evidences. And we will try to simulate everything, whether it is planning, whether it is conducting an interview. So you will be treated as an auditor from the R1 to the hour 40. That is our approach. So by the end of it, there are two outcomes. One is you will feel very, very strong as an auditor, and you will be very confident to face any interview around an auditing role. That's the goal that we are targeting.